Hello. That video we just saw, Dale, it was so striking and so sad, seeing those empty pools and another old industrial city just down on its luck, having very hard times in the school system. That's something you saw in Newark when you wrote the prize. Tell us what kind of parallels came to mind watching that video.
Well, what was striking was I felt as if we were watching a video about Newark, except there were cars in this one, and in Newark there would have been about 15 different industrial products that were built, and that then absolutely just left the city. It also had been, Newark was one of the 20 biggest cities in the country until the Depression, and it seemed that every single force, economic, social, industrial, political, in our country from 1950 on conspired against Newark. The urban renewal was a devastating experience for Newark. The interstate highways decimated the city. White flight, during the migration from the south and the white flight, the racial composition of Newark flipped from 2/3 white to 2/3 black. Over 100,000 white families left.
And so very much northeastern story, northeastern industrial city story.
In the Rust Belt, it's the same. And the same thing with this, not anywhere near the same numbers of loss because it never was as big as Detroit, but, a school district built for twice as many kids as are in it now, and school buildings being closed and leveled, and not leveled. In many cases, they're trying to turn them to other uses in Newark because of the awareness of what it does to a neighborhood when you level a school.
And yet, when you wrote your book, Detroit had you found something that Newark had that Detroit doesn't have, and that was philanthropy. $100 million plus another $100 million, $100 million from the Zuckerberg family, and then a matching amount as well.
Yes.
That Cory Booker, the former mayor, helped raise. So all of this money being poured into the schools, isn't that a good thing? Something so helpful to schools that were struggling with very low graduation rates and all kinds of problems?
I think at the beginning it was seen as manna from heaven. I think a lot of people in Newark felt that this was an opportunity. There was a feeling on the ground in Newark. I think that it's not really known because so much of the message was that Newark had destroyed its own schools and that people were apathetic about the condition of the schools, but it really wasn't true. There was a consensus on the ground in Newark at the time that the status quo was unacceptable. And there were a lot of people who were civic leaders and community leaders who felt that having this big a gift and this much national attention would help focus the whole civic conversation in Newark on education.
And that was when you got first started, there was a lot of excitement, and you were there right from the start. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went from, how the excitement turned to, I think the word I'm going to use here is skeptical, is sort of the attitude that you bring to the book and found in many in the community along the way. Tell us a little bit about that transition.
Well, there was some of that to begin with because Cory Booker, who has a reputation nationally as kind of a miracle worker, an urban miracle worker.
And Newark needed a miracle.
Yes, and it needed at least that. And I think there was a sense among national audiences, among people who, in philanthropy particularly, that Cory Booker could work miracles, that he could take an intractable problem in a poor city and actually move it forward. But on the ground in Newark, he wasn't viewed that way because, that's kind of magical thinking. Changing a situation as dire as Newark's social and economic circumstances doesn't happen through miracles or through quick turnarounds. It happens over a long period of time. And so there was a widespread feeling on the ground in Newark that Cory Booker was that he was basically on his way out of Newark and that he was using this whole Zuckerberg gift and the publicity that came with it to move to his next platform.
Yet there was suddenly all this money into the school system. What happened to it? Where did it go? What were improvements seen immediately in any case?
The money wasn't put into the school district. There was a specific agenda that Booker and Chris Cerf, who was the state commissioner for education at the time, and the people who were the lead actors in the philanthropies that were involved in Zuckerberg's philanthropy, Bill Ackman, a hedge fund manager, his philanthropy. And their whole idea was to take the ideas that had become very prominent in the education reform movement, bring them all together and implant them in Newark. And this was part of what caused the skepticism, as you called it, because the ideas were coming from outside, from people who were wealthy, mostly white, mostly associated with philanthropy and finance, and not people in Newark who had lived the issues in the schools.
So you're saying it's on the ground that didn't go over too well within the community? Because you spent a lot of time in schools and in the community?
Yeah, and I think, there wasn't, in terms of those who planned the agenda, there wasn't anyone who'd ever taught in the Newark public schools or had been a parent in the Newark public schools or who had attended the Newark public schools. And there was a sense, a growing sense that this was being done to Newark and not with Newark.
We've seen over time, though, that there's a little bit of backtracking. I was on a panel last week with Chris Cerf and some others, not on a panel, watching a panel in California that talked about what happened in Newark, and we heard Jim Shelton this morning say that there were lessons that were learned and that this big experiment in philanthropy in schools yielded some very important lessons about working with the community going forward. Do you feel like your book at least moved forward that concept?
Well, I think the Newark experience moved it forward, and I hope the book has had some effect. But interestingly, when Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan announced the Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative, in which they're going to give away 99% of their Facebook stock during their lifetimes, they said that they released 6 principles that they said would guide their giving, and the first 2 were taken directly from lessons that were learned the hard way in Newark. The first one was that they would not do anything for the short term. They would invest only for minimum 25 years, even 50 years, because they said, you can't solve the complex problems of our time with short-term thinking. And the Newark plan was a 5-year turnaround, which really wasn't at all, that they sort of, in saying they would do that, they pretty much set themselves up for failure.
But there's a claim that they're making now that now we're starting to see results and schools are doing better and you are seeing excellent results from some of the charter schools and elsewhere in Newark. Would you disagree with that?
No, I think that the charter schools in Newark are doing very well. They're definitely outperforming the district schools dramatically. And they concentrated, they put $60 million of the $200 million into expanding the charter schools. And within a couple more years, the charter schools in Newark will be enrolling almost 40% of the students in the city, and that compares to less than 15% before it all started. And they are almost, well, not every single one of them, but overwhelmingly the charter schools are outperforming the state average for low-income and minority students.
Is there a downside to that strategy?
The downside is that the district schools, and this is true in every city that has aggressive charter expansion, the district schools cannot downsize as fast as the charters can grow. So as the charters grow, money leaves the district and goes to the charters, and the district has to cut because they can't sort of do a rational downsizing that quickly. And the Newark district schools have a very large structural deficit now that they're scrambling to cut, and hoping that it doesn't mean they'll have to cut teachers and the people who provide the social and emotional supports that are already in short supply in the district schools.
And those are services that are absolutely necessary in a district that's so poor. Talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, some of the schools that you were in were extremely under-resourced, and you painted a very vivid picture of emptiness and loss and struggle.
Yeah, I think that the most dramatic way to describe it is to talk about a kindergarten class where I spent a lot of time. The school is called Avon Avenue School, and it is in the very poorest catchment area in Newark, which is more than half the kids come from families that are below 50% of the poverty line. So it's extreme poverty, and it's concentrated. And in this kindergarten class, there was a remarkable teacher who is really kind of the heroine of my book. This class, the last year I followed her, had 26 students, and 15 of them had child welfare cases. So those are children under supervision of the state child welfare agency because they have, been victims of alleged neglect. They've been exposed to violence. They've been exposed to drugs. They're, suffering from hunger. And she had nobody in that classroom who was like a special education aide to help her with these kids. And some of them were so damaged emotionally and so angry at age 5 that they threw chairs at other children and at her and hit other children and her. And, not only were they not able to learn, but the other children in the classroom were so terrorized that they couldn't learn either. And she, this is somebody who had enormous teaching skills, and there were many days when she simply could not control the class. And she was asking the school district, please, for a special education aide to be focused on these particularly troubled kids. And they kept saying that, they didn't have the money, that she hadn't provided the documentation, and it was 8 months into the school year before she got the help she needed.
And at the same time, she was under enormous pressure to raise standards and test scores and make sure the school was getting results.
Yes, and that, to try to make sure that children who came in not prepared for kindergarten were going to be on a path to be able to read in 3rd grade.
And many of them were held back at the end of the year, correct? Or passed with some trepidation, great trepidation?
There were like 5 kids who were held back, and then others were passed with hopes that they could catch up.
Is that teacher still there?
She left the school district at the end of that year and went to a charter school.
In a way, that story sort of illustrates a very common theme and discussion about poverty in schools and the additional services that are needed. I can't think of anything that would illustrate it more, and yet you said those things are definitely in jeopardy in a school system that's running short on money.
Yeah, and this was, interestingly, this is somebody who actually grew up in Newark, grew up in circumstances very similar to those in her class, of the kids in her classroom, and wanted very much to be a district school teacher. When I first met her, she said she wouldn't consider going to a charter school because, in her view, the charters didn't have kids who came from backgrounds like hers, from the most needy, challenging backgrounds, and those are the kids she wanted to teach. And she got to the point where she felt that, that the district was not providing her the support she needed to do a professional job with those kids. And she decided to give charters a chance and see what it would be like to work in a charter.
Any sense if she's having better results there or doing better or getting more support?
Interestingly, she feels she's getting a lot more support. The charter schools in Newark do, the KIPP charter school network, in the case of the elementary school where she's teaching, has done a remarkable job of getting money to the classroom. So in Avon Avenue School, the district school where she was, there was one social worker for 670 children. So this was somebody who dealt with crises and wasn't able to do therapy. In the charter school that has like 520 kids, there are 3 social workers, and they do therapy with 70 kids a week. So she said she has some kids in her class, and I was in her class, and who are as troubled as some of the most troubled kids were at Avon Avenue, although she doesn't have as many. But she has some, and there's a social worker who comes immediately when a child needs attention.
So such difficult issues. I want to leave a little time for questions from the audience before we have to wrap up here. Looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you. My name is Don Long. I work in K-12 educational equity and excellence. And I'm gathering today the idea that there are kind of 2 tragedies associated with poverty. The first one are the political and economic, structural and systemic causes of poverty. But the second one is almost equal to that, and that is our response to poverty, how we see people who are poor. And it's a tragedy of pathologizing the poor as an other, as an object out there. And I think that's kind of the lesson learned with the Zuckerberg Newark model, is that you can't come into a community from the top down and from the outside, but we have to live in that community. We have to have an organic transformation from within, finding the leaders, the residents in that community, involving them in the reform. So I just wanted to ask you to address that idea of the second tragedy is how we tend, and all of us, we're professional and affluent. We may have come from poverty, but there's kind of a cultural removal that we have in our profession. And how do you kind of overcome that so we don't just repeat these kinds of problems?
You know, I've actually thought so much about how could this money have been spent, or how could this effort have been led, so that it actually could have honored what the community knows about kids and brought along the community, or even come up with a vision that arose from the community and was aligned with what the philanthropists wanted. Because I think there was common ground, it just wasn't looked for and found. So I think what might have made a difference is if there had been a quiet period after this money was promised, and instead of going on Oprah and announcing we have this money and we're going to fix Newark, quietly, that is what happened basically. Quietly speak with teachers in Newark, like go and meet with the best teachers in the most troubled schools, and ask them, what do you need to succeed with children that you don't have, and what do your children need to succeed that they don't have, and build a policy out of that. Now, I'm not saying that had to be all of the money. I think the systemic changes that the changes within the teacher's contract and the evaluation system, many of them were good, but doing that without doing the other, I think really missed out not only on what people in the community felt was important, but what actually was important. And had they had the support of some of the best teachers in some of the most troubled schools, they would have had some of the most respected people in Newark standing with them, and I think that could have made a big difference.
Somebody bringing a mic down here. Can I take a question from right up front? Thanks. Thanks, Dale. By the way, if any of you haven't yet, the book is for sale here, and it's really an excellent read and gets you so deeply inside what happened in this school district that it's completely worth your time.
Hi, Luann McNabb with the National Council of Teachers of English. My understanding was charter schools and traditional public schools receive the same amount of money. So why would Avon have one counselor for 650 students and this charter school have 3? How did that happen?
Well, that happens partly because, the charter school has its own administrative structure and funds schools the way it sees fit, and the district has one also. But the district has much more special education expense than the charter school does. They have a higher proportion of kids in special ed, and they have a higher proportion of kids who have extreme special needs and disabilities, and that's much more costly. And another thing is that the average age of a Newark district school is 80 years old. There's some that were built before the Civil War, and they are in terrible disrepair. I mean, they're not in quite the condition of the Detroit schools in the video, but they are falling down. So many schools have scaffolding around them just to hold up the facades. Actually, there was a time when Michelle Obama came to Newark to kick off her Let's Move campaign, and the night before she came to one of the district schools, a huge parapet fell off of the school building right in front of it and plunged into the sidewalk. And I just was wondering, oh my God, what if that had happened as she was walking in? But anyway, so the repairs and facility maintenance is enormous too. I think there's also a lot of inefficiency in the district schools, which is being addressed because of this huge fiscal crisis. They're cutting everywhere. But I think that over the years, the reason I named the book The Prize is not because of the $100 million from Mark Zuckerberg. It's because the school district throughout history in Newark was a prize for politicians and political bosses because it's the biggest public budget in Newark with huge amounts of contracts and patronage jobs. And it was always there as much to serve the politicians as the kids, if not more.
Great. Thank you so much, Dale. It's been great hearing from you about this book.